Greetings. We are going to get started tonight. I'm not going to spend a lot of time playing any music or anything for you. I just want to get right into this. Um, Hopefully, a couple of you guys join in. And let me answer this text. You guys are already sending me text, so yeah, we're gonna get that sent. All right. Give you guys a few minutes to see if anybody joins in. This is going to be a review of the first semester. And we're going to go through this quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, let me open this up, a lot of time on any one particular topic. I'm going to ask that you don't throw a lot of questions at me while I'm going through it. And what we can do is when we get to the end, I will try to answer questions. Now, if you want to type in a question into the comment section and you guys can interchange or, interact with one another within the comments, that would be great. That would help me out a lot because there's an awful lot of information that needs to be covered. So, like I said, I'm going to try not to answer any questions while I go. If you have questions at the end, I'll have some time at the end where I'll take a look at everything that's there and try to answer what I can. But like I said, you guys can communicate with one another right there in the comment section. It's set up for you all to do that, so I would appreciate that, and that would help me out. And all right, without further ado, I got all my notes here of what I want to talk about. I got the PowerPoint up. A lot of this stuff we've already seen already, so that's why I'm thinking I can get through it very quickly. I'm going to start with 1491 pre-Columbian time period. I don't have a slide for that, so you just get me and you get to stare at the 1607 slide. Now, basically, when we talk about 1491, that's the time period, everything that leads up to Columbus hitting America. What I would focus on with that is the different Native American tribes that we're going to talk about throughout this time period, where they're located, who they're interacting with, their economic systems. Are they hunter-gatherers? Are they, are they more agricultural based, stuff like that. You don't need to I wouldn't get into the weeds. I wouldn't get into the nitty-gritty. Just know the big ideas, the tribes you might want to be aware of. Obviously the Aztecs, the Huron, the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Sioux, the Ute. These are all different tribes that we've talked about throughout this semester so far, so just be familiar with them. I don't need a dissertation on Native American lifestyles, and you don't either, but you do need to know, where they're located geographically. Remember that map we did with the first notebook. Know that kind of stuff. Also, we're going to go right from that time period, pre-Columbian, into Columbus 1492. That's going to lead us into the Spanish colonization. And when we talk about Spanish colonization, they arrived around 1519. You want to be familiar with Cortez and the Aztec Empire. Be familiar with some of the conquistadors, Balboa and others. Again, don't get too deep into it. When we're talking about the Spanish colonization, understand the idea of the mission and the encomienda systems and how they interacted with the Native Americans. The big thing you need to know, and I got my notes right here, so you're going to see me looking back down here because I don't want to forget anything for you guys. But basically, when we talk about all this stuff with the Native Americans and the Spanish, the big effect the Spanish had is going to be disease due to the Columbian Exchange. And speaking of the Columbian Exchange, just know the basics of it. Don't get too you don't have to, if you can know a couple things that went back and forth, that would be great. Like I said, with the Spanish, know about the disease and the effects the Spanish have on the Native Americans. Remember the mestizos, that new race that's going to be created between the Spanish and the Native Americans. Also know that about the same time that the Spanish are coming into North America, the French and the Dutch are as well. The French are going to come in present day Canada. They're going to deal mostly with like the Huron and other tribes up in that area. And you're going to have the Dutch coming into present day New York. And all three of these countries are going to be coming into North America pre-1607. We don't see anything with the English right now, and that's not going to happen until really the late 1500s with the introduction of Roanoke. But even then, we see failure with the Roanoke colony. So we're not going to see any successful English colonization until 1607. And so that's where I'm going to go right now. I'm going to start with the PowerPoint here with 1607, and I'm just going to start talking through it. Again, hold the questions because I don't even have that screen up right now. I'm just focused right on the PowerPoint. When we talk about Jamestown, what I want you to be familiar with, 1607 is when the colonies first came over. You're going to have John Smith and the Virginia Company coming over. Now, this is going to be a joint stock company, so make sure you're familiar with the different type of colonial companies. You had the joint stock, the royal colony, as well as the proprietor colony. Coming in here, there's going to be 3 different regions and different reasons why they're going to be coming over here. Now, the 2 different reasons that the English are going to come to North America. In the northern New England colonies, they're going to come for religious reasons, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But in the southern colonies, primarily in the Chesapeake region, they're coming for economic reasons. Now, when we talk about the Chesapeake region, we're talking current-day Virginia, Maryland, Delaware area. It's all those areas that surround the Chesapeake Bay, hence their name. And what you need to be familiar with is when the colonists first came over in the Virginia Company and arrived in Jamestown, they're going to have to deal with the Powhatan Indians. So be familiar with the Powhatan Wars. Be familiar with the struggles that they had during this time, that first year when nearly half the people died, the starving time. And then what's going to pull them out of the struggle that they face in the Virginia colony in Jamestown is going to be the introduction of tobacco. And if you talk about tobacco, you got to talk about John Rolfe. And talk about John Rolfe, I know you guys want to talk about Pocahontas. These are the people you need to know during this time. Labor systems. Be familiar with the different labor systems that are going to be used in the southern colonies. It's going to start with the indentured servitude and the headright system. These are terms you should be familiar with. Now, with indentured servitude, remember, that's going to come to an end following Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion is going to be a standoff between the Tidewater planters and the frontier settlers. And basically be familiar with what happened there and why it happened. And know especially that it brought an end to the indentured servant program, I guess you will, that England was using, and they're going to switch over to the use of African slaves. Now, the first African slaves are going to arrive in 1619, and it's going to be some time before we see the numbers start increasing. It's not like the first slaves came over and boom, there they all are, but they are introduced in 1619. Now, beyond the Chesapeake region, know the other main regions of the colonies. You make sure you know the New England and the Mid-Atlantic. Now, the Mid-Atlantic we also call the Middle Colonies. And then further south of Chesapeake, the Chesapeake colonies are part of a larger colonial region known as the Southern Colonies. So know the 3 differences, know the different geographies, know the different economics that they used in it, know the different people that are going to settle in these areas. Getting back to the Jamestown and the settlement there, again, Native Americans know the conflicts they had with the Native Americans in Virginia. Again, that was the Powhatan tribe. And, we're going to talk about government here in a minute, but they're going to set up their own form of government as well. I talked about John Rolfe and Pocahontas down there. Bacon's Rebellion is going to be displayed down there in the bottom right. That's going to be led by Francis Bacon. The idea was they're going to try to prevent, or the indentured servants, or the newly freed indentured servants are going to feel like they're getting the short end of the stick with regard to the lands that were available. So they're going to be fighting for new lands, and if you remember correctly, the royal governor is going to be recalled back to England, and Virginia is going to be converted back to a royal colony due to Bacon's Rebellion. The next group of people I want to talk about is going to be in those New England colonies. And when we look at the New England colonies, you have to remember the Pilgrims and the Puritans. The Pilgrims are going to arrive in 1620. They will be followed by the Puritans in 1630. Both of these groups are coming in looking for an escape of religious persecution over in England. Now, the Pilgrims are going to be led by William Bradford, whereas the Puritans are going to be led by John Winthrop. What you need to remember about really the Pilgrims is just that they arrived in 1620. The big thing you want to know about them is the drafting of the Mayflower Compact, which is going to be really the first technical form of a constitution that we have in this country, although the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is really considered a more, what we would, I guess, a straightforward constitution. But the Mayflower Compact obviously has a important role in the history of our government in this country. So just be familiar with that. With regards to the Puritans, we're talking about John Winthrop, the Puritan work ethic, a city on a hill, and all of that. Remember that they came here seeking religious freedom but didn't offer religious freedom. There was a lack of toleration in the New England colonies, and that's when we talked about Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson being exiled from the Puritan colony of Massachusetts because they didn't toe the line of the Puritan beliefs and everything. Williams is going to push for the idea of, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, and a lot of that. So be familiar with the different things that we learned from Roger Williams. And Hutchinson, again, also seen as a dissenter, and spoke out against the Puritan teaching, so be familiar with her as well. But I think the big thing to remember about the Puritan colony and the Massachusetts Bay Colony is that they have the Puritan work ethic. They're going to bring about a lack of religious toleration, which is going to lead others to seek that out and also lead to the beginning of freedom of religion in our country. What else can I tell you about the Puritans? I'm just kind of drawing a blanket at this point, but I'm just kind of, like I said, hitting the big points here. After we talk about Williams and Hutchinson, we're going to talk about the relationship between the Native Americans and the Puritans in that Massachusetts Bay Colony. And of course, we got to talk about both the Pequot War and King Philip's War. Now, the Pequot War, that's the one we talked about. We watched the video. And the big battle there was the Battle of Mystic River. But King Philip's War was very important because King Philip's War was an episode in our Native American history when King Philip tries to bring all the tribes together to go against the English settlers. And in the beginning, they do have some success, but the Puritans and others in the New England colony are going to be able to push them back. That was also known as Metacom's War. So King Philip, Metacom, say guy. The middle colonies, what you really need to be familiar with, William Penn in Pennsylvania. Remember Quaker Oats, Pennsylvania. They were the breadbasket. They grew a lot of grains and stuff like that. They offered a lot of freedom, religious freedom. They're going to, within this area, you're going to see also the founding of New York and New Jersey. Now, New Jersey was originally part of Pennsylvania, and the Quakers are going to sell that off. New York was originally a Dutch colony. It's going to be given to England, and the Duke of York is going to take that. The other one, Maryland, in the middle. Actually, Maryland kind of falls in the southern colonies, but for this PowerPoint here, I have it in the middle colonies, primarily because Maryland is going to be one of the first colonies to offer a refuge for Catholics. The English Catholics were looking for some place to go. They go to Maryland. Lord Baltimore is going to start that colony. The sad part about it for the Catholics is Lord Baltimore is going to open up Maryland to anybody who wants to come there, any religion, as long as they believe in the Trinity. And unfortunately for the Catholics, what you're going to see happen is more Protestants move into Maryland than Catholics, and you're going to have the same problem of persecution of Catholics that they had in England at the time. So while Maryland was started as a free religious society, the Catholics are going to kind of be pushed out of there and persecuted because they're outnumbered in that area. All right, moving on. Going quick. Southern colonies is all about the money, baby. They were there to make the money, and that was it. And so you just remember that most of these are proprietor colonies. You're going to have, some have sole proprietorship, some have, like teamed up and stuff like that. I guess the one exception to that would be Georgia. And if you remember correctly, Georgia was created by James Oglethorpe as a debtor's haven, and they had strict rules going in there. But later in history, we're going to find that Georgia's soil is going to be too enticing for plantations. So a lot of the rules and such that are going to be set up by Oglethorpe are going to kind of fall at the wayside as we discover better and better soil for plantations. And later, cotton is going to be a big crop in Georgia. Just a quick overview. of these three colonial regions. Just so you know the difference between the three, New England, again, was focused on commerce. They were focused on shipbuilding and fishing. This was their economic base. They didn't have good soil. They had rocky soil, but they did have deep water ports that allowed for the shipbuilding. It's going to allow for trade as we go through the colonial development and into the establishment of our country. The mid-Atlantic or the middle colonies, again, remember Quaker oats. They're going to be doing staple crops such as wheat and corn. There's going to be a lot of family farms in this area. You're not going to see, a lot of big, huge farms or plantations like you see in the South, but you are going to see family farms that go beyond subsistence farming. You do have some of the smaller ones, but they're in business to sell a lot of their goods. The southern colonies, like I said, it's about the money, cash crops. Primarily in the colonial time period, it's going to be tobacco, rice, and indigo. We're not going to see cotton move in until really the late 1700s, early 1800s, once we have the introduction of the cotton gin. But initially, it's tobacco, rice, and indigo, and of course, they use slave labor in the southern colonies. Triangular trade, just be familiar with what's going on here. It's the trade of raw goods going to Europe and England, where they're going to create finished goods, which they will trade not only with the colonies, but with Africa as well. Slaves will be part of that middle passage, the passage going from Africa to the colonies. And we talked briefly about the middle passage and how rough it was on these African slaves and how many died on that passage as well. So just be familiar with the triangular trade and the couple different items that were traded within that system. All of this comes under the whole purpose of England setting up these colonies, and that purpose is mercantilism. And mercantilism is the economic regulations that England set up with the colonies. The whole idea was the colonies were there to make money for Great Britain. The problem was they were making money, so they weren't regulating them that much. In 1651, you're going to see England pass a series of navigation acts, and some of the different navigation acts that are going to be passed include you can only use English ships, you can only go into English ports, you can't trade with other countries unless you go through England first. And these were put in place, but they're not going to be enforced until the late 1760s, and we call that system salutary neglect. And this is very important to understand, because this is going to allow the colonists to become more independent. So when we go down the road and have England starting to enforce laws on us, there's going to be kickback, or there's going to be pushback from that, because the colonists are so used to their independence that they don't want to answer to a higher authority, although England has every legal right to do that. That's going to take us into the 1700s. Okay, so we're coming out of the 1600s, we're going into the 1700s, and just remember, coming out of the 1700s, or going into the 1700s, we have seen most of the colonization efforts finished. Georgia actually is not going to be colonized until 1732, but for the most part, with the exception of Georgia, our 13 colonies, at least geographically, are in place. Now we go into the 1700s. The big ideas you need to know about the 1700s, especially 1700 to 1750, is this is when we're going to have two major movements in our country. We're going to have the First Great Awakening, and we're going to have the Enlightenment period. And one does absolutely have an influence on the other. Now, when we talk about the First Great Awakening, what you need to remember are the key players there. George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and remember, it was a lot of fire and brimstone preaching. And what the First Great Awakening is going to do is they're trying to, like in the Second Great Awakening as well, they're both trying to increase church membership. It's a revival in the colonies. And if you remember, George Whitefield actually came from England, and he traveled through all 13 colonies sharing the message of salvation. And what they're doing is they're bringing a lot of emotion into church. And they're presenting this idea that you are in charge of your own salvation. You can make the choice. Now, Calvinism is the foundational teaching of Christianity at this time, and it remains the foundational teaching of the First Great Awakening. If you remember, Calvinism is the teaching that our destinies are set. That there is no God already knows if you're saved or not. But what George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards will teach is you need to, based on that, you need to turn away from sin. You make that choice to turn away from sin because you are part of the chosen. Well, that's going to tie directly into what John Locke is kind of teaching. Now, John Locke is teaching in the Enlightenment with other Enlightenment thinkers that we have these natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And these are God-given rights. And through these rights, we can choose who our government is. Because if our government is not enforcing these rights or protecting these rights, we have the right to overthrow that government. Now, how this ties into the First Great Awakening is you have Whitefield and Edwards teaching that we need to turn away from sin and accept our salvation and choose our salvation by turning away from sin. And Locke is saying we can choose our own authorities. So you put these two together, and what really happens in the early 1700s is you see a lot of people in the colonies start to challenge authority and start to question whether or not the government they have, or not question, but recognize that if the government is not doing what they deem is necessary for them to do, like protecting their rights, they have the right to overthrow that government. And in fact, they have the responsibility to overthrow that government. And that's how the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening come together. Now, some of John Locke's values that are also going to translate into colonial life and later American life is these ideas of religious toleration, that we should tolerate all religions, as well as this idea of the consent of the governed. And the bottom line of this is the government cannot act unless the people give their consent. Because without our consent, without our approval, the government should recognize that it's going to be short-lived, that we are going to come in and step in and overthrow it. And that's what John Locke meant by the right of revolution. We have the right to revolt against our government if they're not doing the job we expect them to do or we want them to do. So hopefully all that makes sense, because these are key ideas and key values of the American Republic and the American democratic system. Some political traditions, as long as we're talking about that, we do have a lot of English political traditions that are going to be introduced in the colonies, and you should be familiar with some of these traditions. An idea of a constitutional government, you're going to see that especially up in the New England region, because that's where we're going to see the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and William Penn is going to draft a constitution for Pennsylvania. The Mayflower Compact was drafted up there. So this idea of a government, led by a constitution, a set of rules that the government has to follow. Whereas the idea that comes down, especially in the southern colonies, is going to be an idea of representative government, and we see that highlighted in the first representative government in our country, the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was established in 1619. So actually, the Virginia House of Burgesses was established a year before the Mayflower Compact was written. So, that's where these ideas are coming from England. It wasn't like we completely came up with this on our own. So keep that in mind. Town meetings are going to be a great example of an egalitarian democratic system where, all the people of the town have a voice. So that's very common in the New England region. Whereas, like I mentioned, the House of Burgesses in Virginia is, especially in the South, was more of an aristocratic representative style government. What we're going to find in our early governments is that, it's the upper class, it's the property owners, it's the wealthy who are going to be, be the government, I guess, if you will. And so we're not going to see really a change in that, until like a complete change where it's, property rights just go away until we see Andrew Jackson and we see the rise of the common man. But understand that all of these, Democratic and Republican ideas are getting started during the colonial period. Don't forget, salutary neglect is still going on during all this time. And while we talk about salutary neglect with regards to trade and commerce, salutary neglect also played a key role in government during this time, because as all these local representative governments are forming in the colonies, England is doing nothing to stop it. So again, it's just building into these ideas of independence and I guess separation from England. We still want to be part of England. We still want to be Englishmen, but we want to do it our way is the best way to look at it. That's going to take us into the 1760s. Now, what leads into the 1760s? Now, let me see if I have it on this. Yeah, right here. The late 1750s, we're going to see conflict in the colonies. Now, we talked quite a bit about the imperial wars that are going on during this time. You have this conflict in the world that's guided between, this fight between England and France for territory in the world. And we talked about the different imperial wars. We talked about like Queen Anne's War. We talked about King William's War. All of this is going to come to a head for the colonists in 1754 with the beginning of the French Indian War. Now, what do you need to know about that? I would say be familiar with George Washington and Fort Necessity, the Albany Plan of Union. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion with the Albany Plan of Union that was written by Benjamin Franklin in 1754. The idea behind the Albany Plan of Union was to unite the colonies to fight with the British against the French. It was never about colonial independence. They were still fighting, just colonial unification to fight the French. The Albany Plan of Union did fail primarily because the colonial regions or the individual colonies didn't want to share their tax dollars or anything like that. I guess if you wanted to compare the Albany Plan of Union to something current day, it's almost like the European Union, where all the colonies were still separate entities within their own, but they were going to come together for one common purpose, and that purpose was the defense of their colonial region. Now, the French Indian War, that's the American title. It's known as the 7 Years' War over in Europe, and it's called the 7 Years' War because while the fighting started here in 1754, it didn't start over in England until 1756, or carried over until that time. But because of the French Indian War, which is going to give England a victory over the France, we're going to see French military and everything move out of the the colonial area, and England's going to have control of all that land. This is going to lead us into, I have it up here, the 1760s, which is known as the Age of Protest. And what are the colonists going to be protesting? They're going to be protesting England's attempts to govern them more, what's the word I'm looking for? More dramatically or more effectually and stuff like that. When the war ended in 1763, the very first Treaty of Paris was signed. England got all that land. The colonists were excited because they thought they were going to get all that land too. The Native Americans, though, were pretty upset because they were left out of the conversation. That's going to lead to Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763. And this is going to take place in the Ohio River Valley. You can see that map that I have there in the top left corner. That's up in the Great Lake region. Pontiac is going to create another pan-Indian tribe. He's going to bring other tribes together, and they're going to have a coordinated attack against English forts throughout the Ohio River Valley. When this happens, England realizes that they do not have the manpower and they don't have the money to protect the colonists or to protect their holdings in the North American territory. So this is the reason. It's Pontiac's Rebellion that's going to lead to the Proclamation Line of 1763. And the Proclamation Line of 1763 was a geographical line in which Great Britain promised the Native Americans, you can have all the land west of that line and we'll leave you alone. And they told the colonists, you can't move anywhere any further west of that line or we will pull you back. Now, this is going to upset the colonists because obviously they fought in the war with Great Britain against the French, and they thought they deserved that right because as Englishmen, and that's seen as English land, so why don't they have the right to it? So that's going to lead to the first conflict between Great Britain and the colonies, and this is the debate over the proclamation line. What's going to follow is the English trying to deal with the cost of the war. They had surmounting debt from the war, and we're talking the war that they fought here in North America. And so they're going to go to the colonists and start taxing them, start looking for payback for their efforts in defending the colonists against the French. Now, the first thing they're going to pass in 1764 is going to be the Currency Act. But the act that's really going to set off the colonists is going to be the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was that tax on all official paperwork and everything. And for the first time, we are going to hear the term no taxation without representation. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to have the colonists are going to be clamoring for more representation in Parliament because they don't have that. I think we've talked about this before. It was called virtual representation is what the colonists said they had, whereas the English Parliament said, of course you're represented, because every time an Englishman takes the oath of office for Parliament, he's representing all Englishmen. So you're represented by that oath. Well, the colonists say we don't have any actual people from the colonies representing us in Parliament, so this taxation, you don't have the right to tax us unless we have a voice in that decision. And besides, at that point, the colonists already had their own system of taxation within the colonies. So they're like, we're already raising taxes. You don't need to tax us any further. And so the Stamp Act is going to be a major legislative action by Great Britain and by Parliament that you definitely need to know. Also, within that same time period, we're going to see the introduction of the First Quartering Act, where the colonists are going to be expected to provide for the soldiers, whether they provide money to build barracks and feed them, or they actually open their homes. But the First Quartering Act is going to be implemented in 1765. Now, what's going to be the response to the Stamp Act is going to be the Stamp Act Congress. And the colonists are going to come together. They're going to send a complaint to the king. And Parliament in 1766 is going to repeal the Stamp Act, which seems like a big victory for the colonists, except right after that, Great Britain passes the Declaratory Act, which says they have the right to legislate in the colonies, and they can pass any laws they deemed necessary for the colonial region. Basically, they say we govern everything, we have control of everything. The next one's going to be the Townshend Acts. Now, while the Stamp Act was repealed, the Townshend Acts is going to come in as a system of taxes on, and what's interesting about the Townshend Act is it's going to be a tax on everybody. You can see in that picture on the bottom, it's going to be a tax on tea, it's going to be a tax on glass, it's going to be a tax on paint, on lead, on paper. So that's going to hit everybody in the colonies. And so this is really, between the Stamp Act and no taxation without representation, the Declaratory Act, we can do whatever we want. The Townshend Acts, we're just going to start taxing the snot out of you on everything. You can see why the colonists are going to start getting upset. And what we're going to see is a rise of such groups such as the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, who are going to seek out ways to inhibit or stop the collection of taxes, whether it's terrorizing the tax collectors, as the Sons of Liberty did with like tar and feathering and stuff like that, or perhaps the Daughters of Liberty and their boycotts and their homespun fabric and all of that. That's going to lead us into the 1770s, and I refer to the 1770s as the age of bloodshed. The first sign of that is going to be, obviously, the Boston Massacre. Now, this is going to happen in 1770. It's going to result in 5 deaths, the first one being Crispus Attucks. The result of that is going to be Paul Revere issuing his etching of the actual massacre that's going to go to all the different colonies, calling for action. Interestingly, this is where John Adams is going to defend the soldiers, and he's going to defend them and prevent them from being charged with murder, so he's going to win that. And that's important because that should have shown England that you could have, or English officials could have a fair trial in the colonies, but they're not going to see it that way. The Boston Tea Party is going to be quiet for a few years. The Townshend Acts are going to be repealed, all with the exception of the tea tax. Now, a lot of people think the tea tax is what's going to cause the Boston Tea Party. It wasn't the tea tax, it was the Tea Act. And the Tea Act was that monopoly that the Parliament set up where only the tea from the British West India Trading Company could be sold. And I think you remember we talked about it in class where this tea was better quality and it was cheaper, but they weren't giving the colonists a choice. And we kind of joked, all what Americans want, we want choices. And so that's going to lead to the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party is going to result in England being very ticked off, especially at the people of Boston, and they're going to pass the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts are really going to be, I think, one of the major steps leading to the start of the American Revolution. I mean, all of these things are steps, but the Intolerable Acts and what they did to Boston was almost seen as a warning to all the other colonial regions. Like, if it can happen in Boston, it can happen here. And when we look at those Intolerable Acts, remember, they shut down Boston Harbor until someone paid for the tax. They took away the Massachusetts, the people, their right to govern themselves. They implemented the Administration of Justice Act, which basically was a slap in the face to Boston, because they said any English official charged with a crime would be tried in England and not in the colonies. The Quartering Act is going to be up. They're going to send more troops into Boston, into Massachusetts, to enforce these rules. So the Quartering Act is going to be boosted. And finally, the Quebec Act. We talked about the Quebec Act, and this had nothing to do with Boston or the Boston Tea Party. Yet it was kind of like, I almost want to say, that little jab that Parliament was getting, saying, look at all this stuff we're giving the colonists up in French Quebec. French, the people we just defeated several years ago in a war, we're giving them more land. We're giving them freedom of religion. We're giving them the ability to govern themselves. And it's kind of like, yeah, we're gonna stab it right at you. As a result, you're going to see that the First Continental Congress is going to come together, and they are going to send the Declaration of Rights and Grievances to the king, saying, these are the complaints we have, we want you to do something. And at the same time, though, and this is often overlooked when you look at the First Continental Congress, they also agreed for all the colonies to establish a militia. And the purpose of establishing a militia was to do, I call it the just in case move. Just in case we have trouble with Great Britain, just in case they up their military, we have the right to defend ourselves. And so that's going to happen with the First Continental Congress. This is going to lead, you know, here I've shown this before. I'll show it again. This is the timeline of events leading up to the beginning of the American Revolution. And I mean, if you wanted to pull one out, I'd say probably the Stamp Act. If you pulled that one out, that might change a lot of stuff, because the idea of taxation without representation, all of that, it kind of, you know, you kind of go downhill from the Stamp Act. But every step leads to what's going to happen in 1775 at Lexington Concord. At Lexington and Concord, you're going to have the confrontation between the British and the colonial troops. The Second Continental Congress is going to come together. They're going to try one more time for peace. They're going to issue the Olive Branch Petition. While waiting for word on the Olive Branch Petition, you're going to have the Battle of Bunker Hill, in which the colonists lose, but they knock the snot out of Great Britain. And that's going to tick off the king. So basically, he's going to say no right away to the Olive Branch Petition, and that's going to lead us into, you know, declaring independence. 1776, make sure you know that is the year of the Declaration of Independence. Prior to the Declaration of Independence being written, Thomas Paine is going to issue or write his Common Sense pamphlet or his essays talking about the need for independence. Make sure you remember that the Declaration of Independence basically embraces John Locke's natural rights, and you're going to see those where his natural rights of life, liberty, and property are going to be Americanized, if you will, by Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, we call those our unalienable rights. The war is going to continue on. Probably the biggest battle you need to know from the American Revolution is the Battle of Saratoga. That's going to happen in 1777. That's going to lead to an alliance with France, and they're going to come in and help us with troops, with money, and with Spain. Spain is also going to bring us assistance as far as money and supplies. That's going to help us win the war. The war comes to an end in 1783. The official war is 1783 with the Second Treaty of Paris, which today is actually the anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Prior to that, the battle that ended the war, 1781, is going to be the Battle of Yorktown. So just be familiar with that, an overview of the American Revolution, and that it was the Treaty of Paris that is going to bring the war to an end. Now, during the war, we had to have a government, so this is when we established the Articles of Confederation. We know the end of the story. We know the Articles of Confederation were too weak, and we learned that with Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a conflict between the Western Massachusetts farmers and the creditors of Boston, and who were demanding payment for loans. And the farmers did not have the money because they'd been off fighting the war, and so there was threat of foreclosures and the loss of their farms. And Daniel Shays is going to lead a rebellion. And what we're going to learn from this rebellion is that our government was not strong enough. It wasn't strong enough to handle this rebellion. If you remember correctly, Massachusetts had to hire mercenaries to come in and put the rebellion down. So when we talk about the Articles of Confederation, what you need to know about it, why was it weak? Because there was no executive branch, there was no judicial branch, and there was no national supremacy. Again, it was like the European Union. You had 13 individual countries under the banner of the United States of America. So, with no power to tax, no power, tariffs and trades, they couldn't regulate trade between states. It was just no good. This will lead to 1787 and the drafting of the Constitution. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, they're going to come together to try to fix the Articles of Confederation. They realize they can't fix it, so they're just going to scrap it, write the brand new Constitution. 1788 is when the Federalist Papers are going to be written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, toting the idea of the goodness of the Constitution and why it was necessary. It was directed at the state of New York. They're trying to get New York to ratify the Constitution. The Constitution will be ratified by all 13 states, although, Rhode Island, I believe, is going to be one of the last states. They're going to be kind of slow on the uptake, but eventually all 13 states ratify the U.S. Constitution. With regards to the Constitution, be familiar with the convention and the different compromises that were made during this time. Recognize, that the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise was a collaboration between the Virginia and the New Jersey Plan, and that's how we got this type of representation we have today. Whereas we have equal representation in the Senate, regardless of your state size. Every state has an equal voice in the Senate, but it's the House of Representatives that representation is based on population, and we still have that today. That's what's also used in the Electoral College, which was also created with the Constitutional Convention. Other compromises, the big one's going to be the 3/5 compromise, whereas the states in, all states really, but it predominantly affected the states in the South. Slaves would count, 3/5 of the total amount of slaves would count towards population. That's going to give more representation to different states, specifically in the South, where they have a low property owning population, but a large slave population. So these are the compromises you need to be familiar with coming out of the Constitutional Convention. Another one that tied in with the 3/5 compromise was the agreement that within 20 years or in 20 years, the United States would stop using the Atlantic slave trade. So 1787, that means that's going to end in 1807. So be familiar with that kind of stuff. Also remember that two men were not there at the Constitutional Convention, and those two men are Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They were acting as foreign emissaries to England and France at that point. So they were not part of the Constitutional Convention or the debate for that matter. The debate also included the Anti-Federalist Papers. Now, a lot of you guys like to think of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists as political parties. Don't do that. This is just viewpoints on the ratification of the Constitution. Now, excuse me, will some of the Federalists join the Federalist Party? Absolutely. Will some of the Anti-Federalists join the Democratic Republican or the Jeffersonian Republicans? Yeah, absolutely. But don't think of Federalists, Anti-Federalists as political parties. These are just positions on the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Closing out the 1780s, we're going to start with Washington's presidency. Now, Washington was elected unanimously by the Electoral College. He is going to surround himself with great leaders to help him lead this country. And that's going to create a precedent for what we call the cabinet today. What's interesting about Washington and why we probably revere him so much is this is a man who gave up power not once but twice. He resigned his power following the American Revolution when a lot of people were pushing for him to basically become the monarch of America. He is also going to give up power after his second term. That's another precedent that Washington sets during his presidency, is only serving as a two-term president. Key events during his presidency, the big ones are going to be the establishment of the economic system under Alexander Hamilton, which is going to create the first national bank. He's going to establish the idea of executive power. The Whiskey Rebellion is going to occur during his presidency. Now, that rebellion is going to be against, I guess that's the Western Massachusetts, or the Western farmers, really, because, you know, living up in the mountains and stuff, going up against tax collectors and stuff like that. That's going to be over the whiskey tax that was part of Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. Please note that the difference between this rebellion and the other two is the U.S. government, especially the difference between this one and Shays' Rebellion, is the government has the power to call up an army and put the rebellion down themselves. So a lot of people say that the Washington's response to the Whiskey Rebellion proved that the Constitution was strong enough to guide our country and would become the law of the land. The other thing that Washington is going to have to deal with, he's going to have to deal with a foreign policy, and he's going to pass the Proclamation of Neutrality, which says that the United States will stay out of all foreign entanglements. At this time, the French Revolution was going on. They were trying to get us involved. Washington said no, and his view of neutrality is going to stick with our country, honestly, until World War I. So that precedent's going to last for some time. It is going to cause conflict on his cabinet between Jefferson and Hamilton, and this is where you start to see the two political parties start to form. Hamilton is going to be, be seen as the leader of the Federalist Party, and Jefferson is going to be seen as the leader of the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson is actually going to resign as Secretary of State over the question of neutrality, but Washington's going to revisit this again because in his farewell address, he's going to give very specific advice to the United States. He's going to warn us to stay out of debt. He's going to warn against political parties that are forming right around him as he's given that speech, and he's going to warn against foreign entanglements, just staying out of other people's business. That's going to lead us into Adams' presidency. Now, Adams, you can say the good, the bad, and the sad. The good is his handling of the XYZ affair. That really established us on a foreign stage that we weren't some patsies that could just be pushed around. So how he handled that is very good. The bad is the Alien and Sedition Act. The Alien Act in which he increased residency to 14 years in order to be a naturalized citizen. And of course the Sedition Act that put limits on the press and free speech. So be familiar with that. I guess the sad is going to be his midnight appointments. Those are going to be the judges to try to get as many Federalist judges on the bench because he knew the Democratic Republicans were coming in and taking over. Next, we have Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Now, he has two terms. The first term, He is going to be, his vice president will be Aaron Burr. This is going to be decided by the House of Representatives. Jefferson's presidency, the election of 1800, is going to be the very first presidency that's going to be determined by the House of Representatives. They're going to have a total of 36 votes before Jefferson is named president. Alexander Hamilton plays a role. He basically convinces Delaware to abstain from the voting, and that's going to give the edge to Jefferson. Burr will serve as his vice president, but he will remove him after the first term. Now, I guess the standoff between Burr and Jefferson in the House of Representatives and those 36 votes, this is going to lead to the 12th Amendment, which now requires that the president and vice president be on the same ticket, whereas before, first place went to the president, second place went to the vice president. So that's going to happen. Now, the big thing in Jefferson's first term is going to be the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the United States. It does violate Jefferson's view of strict interpretation of the Constitution, but it's one of those things where it's too good of a deal, he couldn't pass it up. He definitely believed that executive power should be restrained. So his purchasing this is it increases the power of the executive because he sets a precedent for future presidents in making these kind of decisions. Now, the purchase of Louisiana is going to lead to the expedition of Lewis and Clark, so just be familiar with that. The second term for Jefferson's presidency is going to be kind of blackened by the Embargo Act, and that's where we were dealing with the impressment of our sailors. We were dealing with our ships being taken over. Jefferson was also dealing with the pirates on the Barbary Coast and everything. And finally, with the Embargo Act, he said, that's it. We're not trading anybody. And this is going to cause us a lot of economic strife and everything going into the 18 teens. Now, going into after Jefferson's second term, now one thing that's going to be dealt with, or one thing that's going to spring up, I guess, if you will, during his presidency is going to be the power of the Supreme Court. And that's going to be led by the Marshall Court. John Marshall is going to be one of those Adams appointees who takes office, and he's going to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Key decisions he's going to make, the big one is Marbury v. Madison, which equals judicial review. Other ones we talked about. Gibbons versus Ogden is all about the strength of the Commerce Clause. McCulloch versus Maryland is about, the supremacy of the Constitution and the supremacy, when you cannot, remember Maryland tried to sue the federal government for trying to tax us and stuff like that. So we saw the supremacy of the American government and of the Constitution. Regardless of all of this, the big thing you need to remember is the Marshall Court. Every decision he seemed to make increased the power of the court, increased the power of the federal government. So just keep that in mind when you think of John Marshall. Going into the 18 teens, we're going to see the presidency of James Madison. In his second term, he will be fighting in the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is going to be caused by the impressment of sailors and the Native Americans rising up on the western frontier, being spurred on by Great Britain with the weapons and everything. We discover the weapons after the victory of William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe. You're going to have war hawks calling for war. We do go to war with Great Britain. The war is going to last for about 2 years. Really not a lot talk about there. I mean, you can look at, maybe some of the battles. I mean, really, don't worry about it. Just know that we won the War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent will be signed on December 24th, 1814. It will bring an end to the war. We basically just, let's say, everyone, let's go home and take our guns and go home. It was basically the War of 1812 ended in a tie until about 2 weeks later when we are introduced to Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. This happens in January of 1815, and his resounding victory there is going to lead to this American idea of nationalism and patriotism, and we're going to see what's called Ghent nationalism rise up in our country. Also, we're like 5 years of this, during the second term of Madison's presidency, we're going to see the bank is going to be rechartered, and that's going to happen under Henry Clay's American system. Know the American system, know that it was three parts. It included a national bank, it included the building up of infrastructure in our country, and it also included tariffs being charged to protect American industry. The next president is going to be James Monroe. He's going to issue in what's known as the Era of Good Feelings. James Monroe is the last of the Virginia dynasty presidencies. He's also the last of the first generation of government in our country. Probably the big thing you need to know with him is going to be the Missouri Compromise. And if you want to pick a point when the Era of Good Feelings ends, it's going to be the Missouri Compromise. That's when we're going to see the first state established out of the Louisiana Purchase, and that's going to be Missouri. And the compromise is going to be, held due to a debate between should Missouri be a free or a slave state. Missouri is going to be entered in as a slave state. That's going to cause conflict because there's going to be an imbalance in the Senate between slave and free states. Because of that, Massachusetts is going to cede land to the United States, and Maine will come into our country as a free state. We also established the 3630 line, saying that everything above that line will be free, everything below that line will be a slave state. This is going to last until the entrance of Texas into the Union. So the Missouri Compromise is basically a Band-Aid, but it's a Band-Aid that lasts almost 20 years. This is going to lead us into the next presidency. That's the presidency of John Quincy Adams. This was a result of the corrupt bargain in which you had a close election between Adams, Clay, and Andrew Jackson. Clay is going to end up throwing his votes behind John Quincy Adams. He's going to get the presidency. Henry Clay is going to become the Secretary of State, and Jackson's going to start campaigning right away for the next election. We see a whole new generation of lawmakers come in. These are the descendants of our original founders, so they're looking to, basically make their own mark in time. Like I said, the Era of Good Feelings comes to an end, and Jackson is going to rise to the forefront in politics. Now, 1828, we're going to see Jackson and his push for the common man politics. With common man politics, we're going to see more men being allowed to vote, property rights not being required to vote, and all of that is taking place. The Tariff of Abominations will also be passed in 1828. This is going to be one of the largest tariffs in history, and that's going to cause a lot of strife down in the southern colonies. Now, when Jackson's elected, he will be the very first Democrat elected in history, and we will see an 8-year period of what we call Jacksonian democracy. Really, the 1830s is all about Jacksonian democracy, and it's all about Jackson. You're going to have the Tariff of Abominations, which is going to lead to the nullification crisis in South Carolina. That's going to be a standoff between Jackson and John C. Calhoun. The government is going to pass what's known as the Force Bill, which is going to give Jackson the power to take the military down should it be necessary to force South Carolina to collect the tariff. Remember, South Carolina was saying they were going to nullify the tariff. They were not going to follow that law. Now, just a little bit of a backtrack here, and I'm going to go really quickly because we're already on an hour at this point. The nullification crisis, this type of discussion started back with Jefferson and Madison when they wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and that was in response to John Adams' passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And this idea of nullification was if a state did not believe that the government was actually acting constitutionally, the state could then act on their own and nullify the law. That's what Calhoun is trying to do in South Carolina in 1832. That's what Jackson needed to stop. Henry Clay is going to step in, and they're going to negotiate a lower tariff, and that's going to stop any conflict between South Carolina and the country. But there was a real possibility of South Carolina actually trying to secede at that point. Another big point of Jackson's presidency is going to be the destruction of the National Bank. Nicholas Biddle is going to try to renew the bank early in 1832, and Jackson is going to veto that renewal and basically say he killed the bank. What Jackson is looking to do is get more into like a state-run democracy and state-run banks. He believes the state should have more power. The problem is with the bank, going down and everything, this is going to lead to an economic crisis in our country. Perhaps the biggest thing that people remember about Andrew Jackson is going to be his relationship with the Native Americans and the Trail of Tears. We're going to see 16,000 Native Americans move from their native lands towards Oklahoma, most of them being Cherokee. Now, the Cherokee did try to fight this removal with the court case Worcester versus Georgia. John Marshall did declare that they had the right to keep that land because they were a nation within a nation. Well, that's the last thing that Jackson wanted. The government's going to pass the Indian Removal Act, and that's what's going to lead to the Trail of Tears. 16,000 natives moved, about 4,000 or 25% of them died on the trail. With regards, I don't know if I have it here, I don't have it here. With regards to Jackson and his foreign policy, the Texas question comes up during Jackson's presidency, and Texas does want to be annexed into the Union, but Jackson says no, because he does fear a war with Mexico. And so he doesn't want to deal with that, so he refuses the annexation of Texas at that point. But we know that's going to come up later. The next president is going to be Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren is one of those poor souls or those poor presidents who's going to inherit a bad economy. Through no fault of his own, Martin Van Buren is going to come in, and the Panic of 1837 is going to hit, and he is going to get the nickname of Martin Van Ruin. Not much talk about that, but that's going to take us into the 1840s. The next president elected is going to be William Henry Harrison, the very first Whig president elected. Now, Harrison is only going to stay in office for about a month. He's going to die. A lot of it had to do with the fact that he gave a speech out in the cold without a coat, and he ends up dying. Some people blame Tecumseh's curse, this idea that every president who was elected in the 0 years would die. And that actually happens up and through Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan will be shot, but he will survive. Harrison is going to be succeeded, or his office is going to be taken over by his vice president, John Tyler. John Tyler is often seen as a Democrat in Whig's clothing. He ran as a Whig, but as soon as he takes office, he starts vetoing all of the Whig legislation because we do have a Whig Congress at this point. Now, one thing that John Tyler does do is he is the president who signs Texas into the Union. So it's in his presidency that Texas becomes a union, but it's going to be the next president, James K. Polk, who actually takes credit for it, because James K. Polk is going to run on the Manifest Destiny ticket, that he was going to complete Manifest Destiny. We acquired Texas, and in 1846 he acquires the Oregon Territory, which is going to include Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. And of course, in 1846, we're going to fight in the Mexican-American War. Now, by this point, Texas is already an independent country. Now that it's been annexed into our country, there's a debate between us and Mexico as to where the border is. Is it on the Rio, like we believe, or is it on the Nueces, like the Mexican government believes? This is going to lead to a conflict. Polk will send Zachary Taylor down there. This is going to basically, when both sides cross their respective rivers, we're going to go to war. It's not much of a war. We're seen as the bullies in this by a lot of people. You have people like what's his name? Henry David Thoreau, who is very much against this war, and Abraham Lincoln too. Abraham Lincoln, as a representative in the House of Representatives for Illinois, is going to issue what's known as the spot resolution. The spot resolution is where he says, I want to know the spot where blood was first spilled, where American blood was first spilled. We do win the Mexican-American War. That's going to result in the greatest treaty in the world, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But the result of that treaty is that we gain all this land from Mexico, but that's going to reopen the slavery question. But Manifest Destiny will be completed. We have made it all the way to the Pacific, and the United States basically controls the total continental region. But like I said, the question, Pandora's box, is going to be open. What do we do with slavery? Now, we know during the war, the Wilmot Proviso was tried to be passed, and what David Wilmot wanted to do was he tried to create legislation that basically determined that any land that we got from Mexico would be free. That didn't pass, but you can see the question is already being asked. When it comes right down to it, it's going to be the Compromise of 1850 that settles the question temporarily. There were 5 provisions. You need to know these. You need to know that Texas is going to lose its antenna and the United States is going to pay off their debt. D.C. is going to get rid of the slave trade within their borders. California is going to come in as a free state. The Mexican ceded territory is now going to be, the slavery question will be answered by popular sovereignty. And probably the biggest question or the biggest conflict that's going to arise from the Compromise of 1850 will be the fugitive slave law. It's going to be strengthened. Now, we've had a fugitive slave law in effect ever since 1793 when the cotton gin was invented. They're just going to strengthen it now, and that's going to cause conflict in our country. Going into the 1850s, honestly, so much happens, you can easily remember it by the even number years. 1850 is the Compromise. 1852 is going to be the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. 1854 is going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to lead to 1856, Bleeding Kansas, and also Bleeding Sumner. 1858 is going to be the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They're going to be, these two men are going to be vying for the Senate seat from the state of Illinois, and they're going to be debating not only the Compromise of 1850, but also the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Dred Scott, the Supreme Court ruled that slaves were indeed property, and they also declared that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. So Lincoln and Douglas will be debating this. And then finally, 1859 is going to be Harper's Ferry. That's going to be John Brown, his raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, we got to know John Brown in Bleeding Kansas with the Pottawatomie Massacre, but now he's going and trying to stir up slave rebellions. Slave rebellions were a huge fear down in the South. We had seen Nat Turner's rebellion, we had seen the Stono Rebellion, and John Brown now trying to create his own slave army is going to cause panic throughout the South. The presidents during the 1850s, I call them the 3 blind mice. You started with Millard Fillmore, who followed James K. Polk. He actually is going to be the one who signs the Compromise of 1850. But it's Pierce and Buchanan who don't do much to stop the sectionalism that's growing in our country. Now, of course, Pierce is dealing throughout his presidency with the death of his son. Buchanan is dealing with really just a lack of knowing what really was going on, because he hasn't been present in our country as all this is building, as he was a foreign minister to England. So he's just going to leave it for the next guy. And of course, the next guy is going to be Abraham Lincoln. Takes us into the 1860s. Once Lincoln is elected, we're going to see southern states start to secede. They are actually going to start to secede during Buchanan's presidency. 11 states in total will secede from the Union, 7 before Lincoln's inauguration and 4 after. South Carolina is going to lead the way. The very first, and this is going to lead us to the beginning of the Civil War. Civil War is going to start in 1861. The very first battle will be the Battle of Fort Sumter. We also know the importance of the border states during this time. 4 states remained with the Union, and a lot of that had to do with Lincoln's actions, suspending habeas corpus to aid the vote in Maryland. But Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware will be the border states that are critical to the Union as far as their strategy and such goes. The big battle, the one major battle you need to know is Antietam, 1862. Though it was a tie, it's going to prevent any English or other foreign involvement in the war. So that makes Antietam very important. It was the bloodiest day in the Civil War. What Antietam also did, even though it wasn't a clear-cut victory, it is going to give, I guess, some political power to Abraham Lincoln, where in 1863 he will issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this is going to be issued as a war measure because he wants to give a moral cause to fight in this war. So that's what's going to happen. Now, no slaves are actually going to be freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, those in the border states are permitted to keep their slaves. It was primarily directed at the rebelling states. Now, as time goes and as the Union moves into the South, obviously they will be freeing the slaves as they go. But the Emancipation Proclamation on its own did not free any single slave. Gettysburg, 1863. Make sure you're familiar with the Gettysburg Address and the ideas behind that. 1864, Lincoln is going to be reelected, but barely. If it wasn't for Sherman's march to the sea and his activity and victory throughout the South on his way to Atlanta and Savannah and all the way through, Lincoln probably would not have won. But that's going to allow for Lincoln's victory in the election of 1864. This will lead to the end of the war in 1865 with the surrender at Appomattox between Grant and Lee. Several days later, Lincoln will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and unfortunately, we're going to see his plan for presidential reconstruction kind of fall by the wayside. As we go into Reconstruction, make sure you know the three amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment gave the basically abolished slavery in our country, made it illegal. The 14th Amendment is going to give citizenship, naturalized citizenship to anyone born in our country, including the slaves, and give them the rights afforded to every American. And finally, the 15th Amendment is going to provide the right to vote for all African American males. Now, just keep in mind that the 15th Amendment is what's going to upset a lot of the women's suffrage movements just because they felt like they should have been included in the 15th Amendment. And as we saw in class, that amendment very specifically says it gives the right to males to vote. Also in the 1860s, we're going to see the beginning of presidential reconstruction under Johnson. He is not going to be successful at all. Remember, he was a Democrat from Tennessee, and so he's going to have a lot of trouble with the radical Republicans in Congress who just want to punish the South for their actions in this war. Couple things that happened during this time is you're going to see the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be established, and you're going to see Northerners go down to the South to help the freedmen, whether it be get education, get a job, or something like that. Different groups of people are going to rise up during this time. The carpetbaggers and the scalawags. Carpetbaggers are going to be those from the North who are going down to try to benefit from Southern Reconstruction. Scalawags are actually those who are from the South who side with the radical Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson is going to run into conflict with the Congress quite often. He will be impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act, although he is not removed from office. Basically, what we see is Johnson is a true lame duck president in the sense that the Republicans control the Congress, and even if he tries to veto any bill, his vetoes are overridden. He like I said, he is not impeached. He stays in office, but he really isn't able to accomplish anything. He will be succeeded by Ulysses S. Grant. Grant will come in the late 1860s, going into the 70s as the next president. We talked about all the different scandals under Grant's presidency. Basically, the Credit Mobilier scandal, the Tweed ring scandal. You might want to be familiar with those. One thing that we also see going on in the South, first we saw it under radical Reconstruction, and then it intensifies, is the use of black codes. Now, black codes were put into place to limit the freedoms of the freedmen, to prevent them from obtaining all of their rights. One group that's going to rise up during this time to basically work their magic to keep, the African American suppressed and stuff is going to be the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan is going to rise up. They're going to be a terrorist organization working their way through the South, using their actions to prevent any type of growth of the African Americans in society. Grant is going to get Congress to pass the Enforcement Acts, and the Enforcement Acts are going to allow Grant to use the military to put down the KKK. Also, during Grant's presidency, they're going to pass the first Civil Rights Act. In all honesty, Grant did more for the African American than any other president until the 1960s. So while he had a lot of scandal in his presidency, he did do some good things as well. The scandals, like I said, the tweed ring is a big one. Credit Mobilier is a big one. We talked about the whiskey ring and some other stuff. Just be familiar with this, the big ones like like I said, Credit Mobilier and the tweed ring are probably the two big ones you should be familiar with. Finally, that's going to take us to 1877, the election of 1877, the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. This is going to mark the end of Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877, basically what it does is there is a debate that we have 3 swing states that have both Democratic and Republican electors, and both think their votes should count. The Compromise, what they do is they accept the Republican votes, which is going to give Hayes the victory, and he promises to remove the military from the southern states, thus ending Reconstruction in the United States, and also ending everything that's going to be covered on this test. Now, there's a lot of things specifically I didn't talk about as I was talking. I realized I didn't really touch on the reform movements and stuff, so you do need to know about the reform movements. The temperance movement, suffrage movement, stuff like that. So make sure you know about that stuff. But other than that, like I said, that's pretty much everything. So if you have any questions, now is the time you might want to throw them out there. I'm only going to stay on here for about another 5 minutes unless I have a slew of questions, because I wanted to get done in an hour and I got done in an hour and 15 minutes. And it looks like about 17 of you stuck with me, so good for you. So what questions can I answer, or concerns do you have about the test or anything like that? I'll sit here for a minute and see if anything comes up. You can also, if you don't want to type it on the computer, you can send me a text message and I can look at that as well. Anything you want to send, just let me know. And if not, I'll start the countdown here in just a few minutes. And then, of course, I'll bring Flynn up. All right, I'm not really seeing any questions. So hopefully we covered everything that you wanted me to cover. Got through it really quickly. Just another minute here, and nothing's coming up. No text messages coming in. That's good. So you guys must be ready to go. So it's 8th period tomorrow. Wednesday is 2nd and 7th, right? Or, I'm sorry, no. 1st and 7th. Thursday is 2nd and 6th, and then Friday is 3rd and 4th. So that's what we're going to be doing. Obviously, this video is going to stay online. I'll put it on the YouTube channel. I'll also put a copy of it on my website. So let me go ahead and get Flynn up here. See if I can get him up here. He's got his ball. He's ready to play. Come here, Flynn. Come here. Oh, he wants me to throw the ball, so I have to try to entice him back over here. So if I ignore him, maybe he'll come back. Come here. Come here. Oh, get up there. Come here. Come here. Oh, he's being shy tonight. Come here. You're not gonna get up here? Get up here. Oh no. There, you got a little glimpse. You got a little glimpse of him. He really wants to play. He's got the ball and he's ready to go. So all right, guys. That's gonna do it. You guys have a fantastic evening. I'm gonna go ahead and shut it off now. If you have any questions, again, I will be in early tomorrow morning, and everybody else you can have ask me questions in class tomorrow. All right, guys, have a great evening, and bye-bye.